In 2016, my hiking buddy Lewis and I had been on countless adventures together exploring the dense forests of Washington and Oregon, enduring the scorching heat of the Southwest deserts, and summiting the peaks of the Sierra Nevada. But we had always longed for more, and the next great challenge on our list was the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, known simply as the Frank. This wild, untamed place in Idaho was unlike any trail we had ever set foot on. The Frank sprawled across 2 million acres, a vast expanse of wilderness so immense that it dwarfed any other landscape we had tackled before. We loaded up our gear, packed the car, and embarked on a 2-day drive from California to Idaho, heading up the I-5 before veering east into the heart of the state. The further we drove, the more the landscape transformed, and by the time we reached the trailhead near the middle fork of the Salmon River, we were both filled with excitement. The gravel parking lot was quiet, save for a faded sign warning about bears and fire bans. With our heavy packs slung over our shoulders, we set off into the wilderness. Our lives packed into those bags, our food tents, sleeping bags, and water filters. Everything we needed to survive in the wild. On the first day, we stuck to the main trail, moving steadily through the pines. The forest was eerily quiet, yet there was a peacefulness to it. We covered about 8 miles before stopping near a creek to camp. The evening air was crisp, and we made a quick meal of instant noodles before falling into a deep sleep, ready to continue our journey the next day. Day 2 followed a similar pattern. We pushed deeper into the woods, the trail winding through valleys and climbing ridges. The underbrush grew thicker, slowly swallowing up the path in certain areas. We didn't talk much. It was a silent, almost meditative journey, each of us lost in our thoughts, checking our maps now and then to make sure we were on track. We ended the day after covering 18 miles, setting up camp once again on a flat patch of ground. We boiled more water, ate, and collapsed into our sleeping bags, exhausted but satisfied with our progress. By the third day, though, a restlessness began to settle in. The trail, though beautiful, felt too easy, too familiar. We wanted something real, something that would challenge us beyond the normal hiking experience. When Lewis suggested that we cut cross-country and veer off the path, I didn't hesitate. We were looking for the wild, untouched part of the wilderness that most people never see. As soon as we left the trail, the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their trunks wider than my shoulders, and roots sprawled out across the forest floor like veins under the earth. Moss covered everything, dulling the sunlight and thickening the air. The ground beneath our feet became spongy, making each step slower and more deliberate as we scrambled over fallen logs and avoided rabbit holes. Despite the rough going, it was worth it. The place felt ancient, as if we had traveled back in time, untouched by human hands. A world that hadn't changed in centuries. Then we heard it. A low hum, steady and unnatural. It wasn't the wind, nor was it the sound of running water. The noise was mechanical, almost artificial. We looked at each other. Neither of us speaking, but both of us knew what we had to do. We had to investigate. Following the hum, we pushed forward, weaving through thick vegetation until we broke through a thicket of saplings. And there it was, a bunker. A steel door hung crooked in the frame, its concrete shell covered in strange, unrecognizable symbols. Circles, zigzags, and twisted lines that made no sense to either of us. The hum grew louder, and as we got closer, we could hear the unmistakable sound of distorted, heavy metal music. Aggressive, violent, screaming vocals. At that moment, I froze. The music wasn't what stopped me. It was the thought of the people inside. It didn't seem like a place where someone would throw a party. What kind of people would be way out here in the middle of nowhere? The whole situation felt wrong. Lewis shot me a look, and without saying a word, I nodded. Let's get out of here. We turned to leave, but before we had gone very far, we heard movement behind us. 2 men emerged from the tree line like they had been waiting for us. They were dressed in full camouflage, their faces hidden behind balaclavas, and each of them held a rifle, something that looked like an AK-47. My heart stopped as I realized we were outnumbered and outgunned. They didn't say a word, just stood there staring at us through the slits in their masks. Then one of them raised his rifle and ordered us to get on our knees, arms up. Fear rushed through me, but I didn't argue. Lewis, though, made a move. He unclipped his pack, dropped it, and bolted. The sound of his pack hitting the ground snapped me out of my fearful trance, and I followed him. Gunfire cracked overhead, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a bullet striking a tree, splintering the bark beside me. We ran, weaving in and out of the trees. Dodging shots meant to slow us down, not kill us. Our lungs burned. Our legs ached, but we kept going, driven by a primal need to escape. Eventually, the gunfire stopped and we slowed to catch our breath, realizing we had lost the men, but also realizing we had lost everything else, including our packs with all our food gear and maps. We were now stranded in the wilderness without the resources we needed to survive. As night fell, the temperature dropped and we huddled for warmth, fighting off hunger and fatigue. The first night was brutal, the cold seeping into our bones, but we survived. We found some berries to eat the next day, but hunger and exhaustion set in fast. The forest stretched on a never-ending expanse of trees, and it was only when we finally stumbled upon a dirt road that we felt a flicker of hope. We reached a ranger station where we reported everything: the bunker, the armed men, the strange graffiti, and hoped the authorities would investigate. But when the rangers returned, they said the bunker was empty and there was no sign of the men who had chased us. The police suggested it was likely a militia group, a violent, armed group that didn't like witnesses. We were lucky to be alive. Driving back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the Frank had changed for me. It was no longer a place of adventure and escape. It had become something darker, something to be wary of. The journey into the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in Idaho started out like any of our other hiking trips. By 2016, my friend Lou and I had been hiking together for years. We had trekked through the forests of Washington and Oregon, baked ourselves under the scorching sun of the Southwest deserts, and climbed the rugged peaks of the Sierra Nevada. But the Frank Church Wilderness, known simply as the Frank, was different. Spanning over 2 million acres, it was a massive and remote expanse of wilderness so vast that it dwarfed any adventure we had undertaken before. We packed up our car, drove north from California to Idaho, and prepared for what was supposed to be a straightforward long-haul hike. The drive itself was a 2-day ordeal. We took the I-5 north, then veered east into the interior of Idaho. The landscape gradually shifted as we drove the flat farmland, giving way to the rugged mountains and dense forests that define the heart of Idaho. Once we arrived at the trailhead near the middle fork of the Salmon River, the sight of the vast wilderness ahead of us sent a thrill of anticipation through both of us. The parking lot was small and gravel-strewn, with a faded sign warning of bears and fire bans. Nothing unusual for a trailhead in the wilderness. But as we unloaded our packs and felt the weight of our gear, we were reminded that everything we needed for survival, food tents, sleeping bags, water filters, was packed into these heavy bags. These bags were our lives for the next several days, and it felt like everything we had was riding on our journey ahead. The first day was a steady pace as we followed the trail through the pine forest. The forest was quiet, but not ominously so. Just a gentle silence that wrapped around us like a blanket. We covered about 8 miles, setting up camp by a creek just before dusk. The sun dipped low and we boiled water for instant noodles, eating and then collapsing into our sleeping bags. The day's exertions taking their toll. The night was peaceful and we fell asleep quickly, knowing the next day would bring even more of the wilderness to explore. Day 2 was similar. We pushed deeper into the woods. The trail winding through valleys and ridges. The underbrush became denser, swallowing up the path in some places, and the forest felt more alive with every step. We barely spoke, just ate trail mix, checked our maps occasionally, and made sure we were still headed in the right direction. We walked for about 18 miles, our bodies adjusting to the weight of our packs, the steady rhythm of the hike. By the time we set up camp for the second night, we felt completely dialed in, like we were in tune with the land. As we ate dinner and relaxed, we shared the same thought. We were ready for more. It was on the third day that the sense of restlessness began to settle in. The trail had been fine for the first 2 days, but we wanted something more, something real. We didn't come all this way to follow a simple path. We came for the adventure, for the challenge. Lewis suggested we leave the trail behind and cut cross-country through the dense forest to see what most hikers missed. Without hesitation, I agreed. The shift was almost instant. The woods around us became thick with towering trees, their trunks wider than my shoulders and roots sprawling beneath the earth like veins. The moss draped everything, dulling the sunlight and carpeting the ground with a soft, sponge-like cushion that made every step feel slow and deliberate. We moved carefully, watching where we stepped, scrambling over fallen logs and avoiding the rabbit holes that seemed to pop up from nowhere. Despite the rough terrain, it was exhilarating. The forest felt untouched, like we had stepped back in time. No human footprints, no sign of civilization. It felt like we were the first to explore this part of the wilderness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were discovering something that no one else had seen in centuries. Then, without warning, Lewis stopped in his tracks. He tilted his head to the side, listening intently. I caught the sound too, a low hum, steady and unnerving. It wasn't the wind or the sound of rushing water. It was something artificial, mechanical. We didn't speak, but our curiosity pulled us forward, the sound growing louder as we moved in its direction. After a few minutes of pushing through the dense forest, we broke through a thicket of saplings and found ourselves in front of a strange, unexpected sight. A bunker, the steel door was crooked in the frame, and the concrete shell of the structure was covered in scratched symbols, circles, zigzags, and lines that twisted into nothing. Recognizable, the hum emanated from inside, and as we approached, the sounds of distorted, aggressive heavy metal music filled the air. It was a violent, hardcore soundtrack, the kind you'd expect from a death metal band. But what really made us hesitate wasn't the music, it was the thought of who might be inside, who would be out here in the middle of nowhere, hidden away in this old concrete bunker. The more I thought about it, the less it seemed like a party, and the more it seemed like something far more sinister. I shot a glance at Lewis. Without saying a word, we both knew what to do. We turned around and started to leave. But just as we made a few hundred yards of distance, the worst happened. Two men emerged from the tree line like they had been waiting for us. They were dressed in full camouflage, their faces obscured by balaclavas. Each man was holding a rifle. AK-47 style barrels lowered, but gripped tightly. My blood ran cold as I realized we were outnumbered, outgunned, and in serious danger. They ordered us to kneel, arms up, and my instinct told me that we weren't going to make it out of this easily. But then Lewis made his move, and in one swift motion he unclipped his pack, let it drop, and bolted into the woods. The sound of his pack hitting the ground was enough to snap me out of my daze. I followed suit, yanking my own pack off and running after him. Gunshots rang out behind us, the bullets slamming into the trees, narrowly missing. We ran for what felt like forever, dodging trees and branches, our hearts racing. Finally, after what seemed like miles, the shots stopped. We had lost them, but at what cost? Our packs filled with all our supplies were now in the hands of the men chasing us. That night, without food gear or any shelter besides the jackets on our backs, we huddled together, our bodies shaking from the cold. The wilderness had become our enemy. Hunger gnawed at us, but we had no choice but to keep moving the next day. The forest stretched endlessly before us, and it was only after another long, grueling day of walking that we found a dirt road and finally saw a ranger station in the distance. As we stumbled into the station, filthy, exhausted, and near collapse, we recounted everything: the bunker, the armed men, the symbols, and the chase. The ranger listened intently and called the authorities. However, when the rangers returned after investigating the bunker, they found it empty. No people, no equipment, just a concrete shell and strange graffiti. The police suggested that we had stumbled upon a militia group, the kind that hides out in remote places like this, training or living off the grid. They told us we were lucky to be alive, but there were no arrests, no further investigation, just a warning to stay away from that part of the forest. On our drive back home, the excitement and adventure we had once felt in the wilderness faded into something darker. The forest, which had once been a place of freedom and discovery, now felt menacing, uninviting, and hostile. Neither Lewis nor I spoke about hiking again for a long time, and we both knew why. Something had changed in the Frank. We had seen something, heard, something that was beyond our understanding, and it was a reminder that even the wildest places can hide the most dangerous secrets. The experience that Lewis and I had during our hike in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in 2016 is one I'll never forget. It was a journey that started with the usual excitement of a long-awaited outdoor adventure, but ended with us facing things we were never prepared for, things that remain a mystery to this day. It all began as a simple plan to explore the vast wilderness, one of the most remote and rugged areas in Idaho, but it soon turned into an encounter with the unknown that we couldn't explain. We had been hiking partners for years, trekking through forests, deserts, and mountain ranges. But the Frank Church Wilderness was a different beast. The forest stretched endlessly before us, an untouched land of towering trees, rushing rivers, and dense underbrush. We had driven up from California, taking 2 full days to get to the trailhead near the middle fork of the Salmon River, where we parked in a gravel lot. It was a quiet, isolated place with only a faded warning sign about bears and fire bans for company, with our heavy packs loaded with all the essentials: food tents, sleeping bags, and water filters. We set out on what we thought would be a relatively straightforward journey. The first 2 days were nothing extraordinary. The trail led us through the quiet, dense pine forests, and we kept a steady pace. We covered about 8 miles on the first day and camped by a creek. The night was peaceful, and we woke the next morning ready for more. On day two, we ventured further, making our way up winding ridges and through valleys. The path became increasingly swallowed by thick underbrush, making it harder to navigate, but we kept going. By the end of the day, we had trekked 18 miles and set up camp once again. We were getting into the rhythm of the wilderness, and the sense of adventure was starting to take hold. But by the third day, things started to feel different. There was a sense of restlessness that had begun to gnaw at both of us. We had come all this way to experience something real, not just follow a well-worn path. So when Lewis suggested we veer off the trail and explore the wilderness across country, I agreed without hesitation. The change in the environment was immediate. The woods became incredibly dense, the trees towering above us, their trunks wide and twisted. The forest floor was covered with thick moss, almost like a sponge under our feet, and the light from the sun was barely able to pierce the thick canopy above. It felt primal, untouched, a place that hadn't seen human feet in ages. As we moved deeper into the forest, it was clear that we had left the beaten path far behind. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant sound of birds. We were no longer in a place where humans had left their mark, and for the first time it felt as though we were truly alone in the wilderness. But that feeling of solitude quickly shifted to something else. It wasn't long before we both heard it, the low hum, a steady sound that seemed completely out of place in the quiet of the forest. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't the sound of water. It was mechanical, artificial, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the forest. Without exchanging a word, we both followed the sound, curiosity pushing us forward. After a few minutes of navigating through the thick underbrush, we broke through the dense trees and found ourselves in front of a bizarre sight, a bunker. The steel door was crooked in the frame, and the concrete walls were covered in strange symbols, zigzags, circles, lines that twisted into unintelligible shapes. The hum grew louder, and as we approached, we could hear the unmistakable sound of loud, distorted, heavy metal music blasting from inside our home. The music was violent and aggressive with screaming vocals that seemed completely out of place in such a remote location. It was the kind of music you might expect from a hardcore metal band, but there was something unsettling about the whole scene. It wasn't the music that made us stop, it was the thought of who might be inside. The door was barely open, just an inch enough for the noise to spill out into the forest. I could feel my heart rate quicken, not from the music, but from the realization that we had stumbled upon something dangerous, something that we were never meant to find. Lewis shot me a look, and without a word, we both knew that it was time to leave. We turned around and began walking back, aiming to put as much distance between us and the bunker before nightfall. But we didn't get far. Just a few hundred yards away, we were confronted by two men who stepped out from the tree line. They were dressed in full camouflage, their faces hidden behind balaclavas, and each of them held a rifle. My blood turned to ice as I realized we were outnumbered, and more importantly, outgunned. They didn't move at first, just stood there staring at us through the slits in their masks. The sound of the hum from the bunker was faint behind us, but it only added to the eerie feeling that had settled in. Without warning, and one of the men raised his rifle and ordered us to get on our knees, arms up. There was no room for negotiation, no chance of escape unless we obeyed. I looked at Lewis, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. We were trapped. Our pistols were still in our packs, nowhere near us, and we were at the mercy of these armed strangers. But then in an instant, Lewis made his move. He unclipped his pack, let it drop, and bolted. The sound of his pack hitting the ground snapped me out of my fearful stupor, and I followed suit, yanking my pack off and running after him. The gunshots rang out immediately. One shot cracked overhead, and another slammed into the tree beside me, sending splinters flying. We ran zigzagging between trees, our hearts pounding in our chests, as we heard the men behind us yelling. More shots followed, kicking up the dirt around us, but we kept running. We didn't know how far we ran, but eventually we stopped panting and gasping for air. We had lost them, but at a cost. Our packs were gone, our food and gear now in their hands. That night we huddled together under the cold, dark sky, unable to make a fire because of the risk. The cold seeped into our bones and hunger gnawed at our stomachs. But there was nothing we could do except wait for dawn. The next day we continued walking the forest, stretching endlessly around us. By the time we reached a dirt road and saw the ranger station in the distance, we could barely stand. We were exhausted, hungry, and emotionally drained. But we had made it when we finally got help and reported the bunker and the armed men the authorities investigated. But when they returned, they said the bunker was empty. No one had been there and there was no sign of our stolen packs. The police suggested it was likely a militia group and we were lucky to have escaped, but the feeling of dread remained, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we had encountered in the wilderness was something far darker than a mere survivalist group. The Frank Church wilderness had changed for us. It was no longer a place of adventure, but one of fear and mystery. In 1983, I was part of a search and rescue team working in the Olympic National Forest. The call came in late Tuesday night while I was finishing my shift at the station. A local hiker named Terry Fishgold, who had been walking the trails for years, had not returned from one of his solo hiking trips. His wife hadn't worried at first, thinking he might have stayed out longer than expected. But when Monday evening rolled around and there was still no sign of him, she called to report him missing. By Tuesday, we had all the details. His description, the gear he was carrying, and his last known location, which was a trailhead near the Quinault River about 8 miles north of the ridge he was supposed to be hiking to. It seemed like a routine search and rescue mission. Terry was an experienced hiker who knew the forest well, and we were confident we'd find him by sundown. We gathered the team early the next morning, about 30 to 40 of us, including local law enforcement and civilian volunteers, and split up the search area into a grid. My team took the western edge near the river while others fanned out to the east. We planned to sweep north, reach the ridge by nightfall, and find Terry. We set off at exactly 5:47 a.m., the forest calm around us as we walked. The first few hours dragged by. There was nothing to report, and we moved slowly, scanning for broken branches or signs of Terry's passage. We occasionally called out his name, but the forest remained eerily silent. By noon, there was still no sign of him. Then my radio crackled to life. One of my team members had found something. I adjusted my course and hiked half a mile east to meet the rest of the team. When I arrived, the sight was unsettling. High in a tree about 30 feet off the ground was a backpack. It was torn open, its straps flapping in the wind, and its contents had spilled out onto the branches below. From the description given by Terry's wife, we immediately recognized it as his green Kelty pack, with a red patch stitched on the side. It looked like it had been thrown with an impressive amount of force. One of my team members, Jim, volunteered to climb the tree to retrieve it, rigging a rope and harness before scaling the thin, fragile tree. As he brought it down, we saw the damage up close. The fabric was shredded, long gashes running through it. There were no bites or scratches, just jagged rips, as if something sharp had torn it apart. Inside, we found his cracked water bottle and a soggy, half-eaten sandwich. But there was no blood. Not yet, anyway. The discovery of the backpack was the first unsettling sign. But it was only the beginning. 2 hours later, another team member radioed in with a discovery: Terry's boot. It was in a small clearing, sitting upright, as though he had simply stepped out of it. There was no blood, no damage, just the boot perfectly tied, standing there alone. We marked the spot and moved on, assuming we would find the other boot nearby, but we didn't. About an hour later, another team called in from the eastern edge of the search area, almost 2 miles away. They had found the second boot, but this one wasn't empty. Terry's foot was still inside, severed just above the ankle. The break wasn't clean. The skin was torn, and there were flies circling the wound. The blood was still sticky, suggesting that it hadn't been there long. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the discovery sinking in. This wasn't a simple accident or injury. Something else was at play here. We widened the search grid, combing through the forest in tighter sections. It didn't take long before we started to notice something strange: blood. At first, it was just a small smear on a tree, barely visible, but then it became more frequent. It was on the bark of trees, higher up on branches, and even splattered across rocks. The blood seemed to be everywhere, spread in no discernible pattern. It was as if someone had been walking through the forest, carelessly, splattering blood in every direction. My team started marking the blood spots with flags, but the more we found, the more the situation felt unnatural. This wasn't a typical search and rescue mission. As the day wore on, the fog began to roll in and the forest grew heavier. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on us. We stopped trying to make sense of the blood trail and just kept moving, hoping that we would find Terry, or at least some sign of him. But as the hours passed, it became clear that the chances of finding him alive were slim. By the afternoon of the third day, we called off the search. Terry was dead. No one could lose that much blood and still be walking around. The official report listed the cause of death as an animal attack. A bear most likely was responsible for the torn pack and the severed foot. But as I stood there looking back at the trees where we had found the blood trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. A bear wouldn't throw a backpack 30 feet into a tree. A bear wouldn't spread blood across the forest like that, deliberately marking sections of trees. Rocks and logs, I had seen plenty of bear attacks, and they didn't look like this. The torn flesh, the scattered bones, the mess of guts, that's what I had expected. But this was different. The investigation ended there and we packed up and left. The police were satisfied with the explanation, and we were left with only the strange, eerie remnants of the search. As the team dispersed, I couldn't stop thinking about that pack in the tree and the foot in the boot. It haunted me even after I left the field and moved on to other things. The team never really talked about the mission again. Some of us, like Jim, stuck around, but he grew quiet, turning to drinking more than ever. Others, like Paul, stayed in touch for a while, but eventually they faded out of my life. One by one, team members moved on, but none of us ever truly let go of what happened out there. Years later, I spoke to Paul again and asked him what he thought really happened that day. He simply said, "We didn't find him because he wasn't there to find." I knew exactly what he meant, but I didn't agree with him. Whatever took Terry wasn't a bear. It tore him apart piece by piece and marked the forest with what was left. I believe he was still there somehow in that forest waiting to be found, though we never truly uncovered what had taken him. The bloodstains are still on the map I kept from that search. Little red X's marking where the blood was found, stretching out across the grid like a web. I don't look at it often, but when I do, it sends a shiver down my spine. Something happened in those woods, something we'll never fully understand. And whatever it was, it's still there lurking, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it. During my time as a forestry surveyor in the early 1990s, I had the privilege of working in the remote and vast Vunut National Park in Yukon, Canada. The park itself spanned over 4,000 square kilometers, a sprawling wilderness of dense forests, jagged ridges and boggy lowlands, an environment so wild and untamed that it could easily swallow a man whole. I had been accustomed to solitude, spending long solitary days in the forest, mapping and surveying the land. The quiet of the woods was often my only companion, and I grew comfortable with it. However, nothing could prepare me for the unnerving experience I had in late August of 1993, an event that would haunt me for years. It all started like any other day. I woke up at dawn, broke camp, and set off in search of a drainage line to plot for my survey. The air was crisp, and the sounds of the forest slowly began to stir. As I made my way through a thick stand of spruce trees, my pack was heavy with the equipment I needed, and I trudged forward enjoying the isolation of the park. But as I made my way deeper into the forest, something about the trees ahead began to seem off. They weren't standing upright, they were leaning outward as if something had pushed them. I stopped in my tracks, adjusting my pack, and squinted through the branches ahead. There, just beyond the odd alignment of the trees, I noticed a clearing. Stepping closer, I felt the ground beneath my boots soften, and I sank slightly into the earth as I approached the center of the clearing. What I saw next sent a chill down my spine. Everything within the clearing was white, bleached, ashy white. The trees stood like skeletons, their bark peeling away in dry, powdery flakes. The ground beneath me was brittle, cracking with every step, and the air itself seemed unnaturally still. It wasn't frost and it wasn't fire damage. There was no clear explanation for the pale, lifeless quality of the landscape. It was as if the entire area had been drained of color of life. I moved cautiously into the center of the clearing, my unease growing with every step. In the middle of the clearing was a small crater, no larger than 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It wasn't a meteorite impact. It didn't have any debris, rocks, or burn marks. The hole was simply an empty, shallow scoop in the white earth, surrounded by a strange, unnatural stillness. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something about this place made my skin crawl. I felt as if I were being watched, though I could see no one. The air was still and the forest seemed eerily quiet, as if the birds and insects had disappeared. A sharp chill crawled up my spine, and I couldn't help but feel that I was standing in the middle of something far beyond my understanding. My instincts told me to leave, but curiosity tugged at me. I pulled out my analog camera, hands trembling as I fumbled to get the lens cap off. I had to get proof. I had to show my superiors what I had found. The site was unlike anything I had encountered in all my years of surveying. I took several wide-angle shots of the strange ashen trees, followed by close-ups of the crater itself. The camera shutter clicked repeatedly, but with each shot my unease only grew. I felt increasingly unsettled, as if the very act of documenting this place was somehow wrong. but I continued knowing that I needed to capture what I was seeing to prove that I hadn't imagined it. After taking the photos, I packed my camera back into my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and started to make my way back out of the clearing. I didn't want to be there anymore. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I had been out there for hours by this point, and the journey back to the ranger station was long, about 6 or 7 hours in total. But as I continued walking, my head started to ache, a dull throb that worsened the further I went. I chalked it up to the weight of my pack and the strain of the hike, but it wasn't long before the pain turned sharper. My stomach twisted, and I began to feel nauseous. I stopped several times to drink from my canteen, but it didn't help. The sensation in my body grew worse with every step, as if something was wrong. Something was happening to me. By the time I reached the last ridge before the ranger station, I was drenched in sweat. My breath came in shallow gasps, and my vision blurred. I leaned against a tree to catch my breath, but just as I thought the worst had passed, I vomited a violent rush that left me gasping for air. I wiped my mouth, feeling weak, and realized that whatever was happening to me wasn't just the result of a long hike or dehydration. Something was seriously wrong. When I finally staggered into the ranger station, I could barely stand. The ranger on duty, Pete, took one look at me and immediately radioed for medical help. I don't remember much after that. The paramedics arrived and I was rushed to an ambulance. They asked questions where I had been, what I had eaten, whether anything had bitten me, but I could hardly form coherent answers. I mumbled something about the strange clearing and the white trees, but my words came out jumbled. I blacked out soon after, and when I came to, I found myself in a sterile hospital room hooked up to an IV. The doctors explained that they believed I had contracted a nasty viral infection, likely from an insect bite. They stabilized me with fluids and antivirals, and after a few days I was able to stand again, but I still felt hollowed out as though I had been drained of my energy. They assured me that I would recover, but my mind kept returning to that strange clearing, to the crater, and the white trees that had drained the life out of the land around them. When I returned to headquarters, I handed over my camera to my boss, a gruff man named Harris. He asked about the photos and I explained what I had found. The technician who developed the film, however, came back with a blank face laying out the prints on the table. Every shot of the clearing of the trees and the crater was nothing but a blurry mess of static, overexposed, underexposed, or just pure distortion. The other photos from my trip were fine, but the images of the white bleached area were completely ruined. I couldn't understand it. I tried to explain to my boss what had happened, but without proof, they chalked it up to my fevered delirium. Harris suggested I take it easy and just focus on my usual tasks, mapping trails and counting trees. He didn't accuse me of lying, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He told me to drop it as it was bothering the rest of the team, but I couldn't. I couldn't forget what I had seen out there, and I couldn't forget the feeling of being watched, of standing in a place that wasn't supposed to exist. As time went on, the memories of that place, of the clearing, the trees, the crater, never truly left me. Even after I left the Forestry Service in 2004, moved south to Whitehorse and settled into a quieter life, the memories would still surface from time to time. I kept the blurry photos in a desk drawer, occasionally pulling them out to stare at the white smears that had once been clear images of something I couldn't explain. The meteorite theory didn't fit. There were no signs of radiation or chemical exposure. I tried to convince myself that there was a rational explanation, but I couldn't find one. Years have passed, and I've grown older, but I'll never forget the feeling of standing in that clearing. The strange drained land, the unnatural stillness in the air. It was as if I had stumbled upon something that didn't belong in this world. And I know now that if I ever see anything like it again, I'll be walking the other way. I don't want to find out what it was, but deep down I know that it's still out there somewhere, waiting to be discovered. A few years ago, I decided to go on a solo hike. It wasn't something I usually did, but I had been feeling cooped up, like I needed a breath of fresh air and a break from the hustle of daily life. I grabbed my keys, threw a water bottle into my backpack, and drove out to a trail I had heard about. It was about an hour away, tucked deep into some woods I had never explored before. The drive was quiet, with only the hum of my engine and the trees blurring past the windows. It was just me, the open road, and the anticipation of being in nature, free from distractions. Little did I know that the experience would turn into something that would haunt me for years. I parked my car in a small gravel lot near the trailhead and locked it up, feeling the excitement of a fresh adventure ahead. The trail looked well-worn, not too popular, but enough to suggest it had seen some foot traffic. I stepped into the woods, the path quiet and peaceful, the air crisp and fresh. There was no sign of anyone else, and for the first time in a while I felt completely alone, in a good way. As I made my way along the trail, everything felt normal, soothing even. But what happened next would take everything I knew about the woods and flip it upside down. At some point, I noticed a strange sensation creeping in. It was subtle at first, a mild unease, like something was just a little off. I couldn't place it. The forest was still beautiful, quiet and calm, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was a familiar sensation from other hikes, but this time it was stronger. I pushed it aside, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But then something happened that I couldn't explain. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a massive shadow passed over me. It wasn't a small patch of shade, like a bird passing overhead, but something much larger. It covered the entire clearing. I was in blocking out the sunlight for a brief moment, as if someone had flicked a switch and turned off the sun. I froze mid-step, water still dripping from my chin as I looked up, but the sky was still that perfect cloudless blue. There was nothing there, no planes, no birds, nothing that could explain such a large shadow. It was as if something massive had glided over me, silent and swift. I stood there, unable to move, trying to make sense of it, but I couldn't. It didn't feel natural, and my heart rate quickened as I scanned the skies, my mind racing with possibilities. Andre, a friend of mine who had joined me on some previous hikes, was with me on this one, and he noticed it too. He froze, staring up at the sky in disbelief. He had stopped talking, and the tension between us was palpable. "What the hell was that?" he muttered, his voice filled with the same confusion I felt. I didn't answer immediately, was still scanning the treetops and the sky for anything that could explain the large, swift shadow. There was nothing. No birds, no planes, not even a hint of movement in the trees. It was the strangest thing I had ever experienced. Then, as if on cue, the wind shifted. It wasn't the usual breeze that rustles the leaves or cools your skin. This wind came suddenly, stiff, cold, and unnatural. It rustled the trees and kicked up dust from the trail, but it felt like it was chasing something, as if the wind was following the shadow. My heart started to race, the air felt charged with something, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had cast that shadow was still there somewhere in the forest watching us. Andre turned to me, his face pale, his hand gripping the map with a white-knuckled intensity. "Did you see that?" "You saw that, right?" he asked, his voice shaky. I nodded, but I didn't have an answer. We stood there, frozen in the quiet of the woods, waiting for something to happen. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. It was like the world had stopped moving. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear Andre's breathing beside me. We waited, expecting something to break through the trees or drop out of the sky, but there was nothing, just an oppressive silence. I was the first to move. I couldn't stay in that spot any longer. "We should go." I said, my voice low, though. I wasn't sure if Andre even heard me. He was still scanning the trees, his eyes darting from side to side, looking for whatever it was that had passed overhead. He didn't argue. He stuffed the map into his pack, and we turned to head back, cutting through bushes and trees, ignoring the trail altogether. We didn't want to risk staying on the path. The woods felt like a trap, and all I wanted was to get out of there as fast as possible. Every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind made me jump. I kept looking up, half expecting the shadow to return, but it didn't. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for us to leave. We didn't talk much during the walk back. Neither of us wanted to speak the words that were on both our minds. Something was wrong in those woods, something that didn't belong. It took us about an hour to get back to the trailhead, though it felt like much longer. I was drenched in sweat by the time we reached the parking lot, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us, hidden in the trees when, in the summer of 1983, I found myself involved in one of the most unsettling search and rescue missions of my career. It started like any other day. I was working with a search and rescue team in the Olympic National Forest when we received a call late on Tuesday night. A local hiker, Terry Fishgold, had gone missing after a solo hiking trip. His wife had waited until Monday evening to report him missing, thinking he was just delayed, but by Tuesday she grew worried. His last known location was a trailhead near the Kino River, with his intended destination being a ridge about 8 miles north. Based on the information, we figured we would find him quickly. Terry was an experienced hiker and well acquainted with the area. A routine search, we thought, but we couldn't have been more wrong. The next morning, we gathered a team of 30 to 40 volunteers and law enforcement officers at the trailhead just before dawn. We split the search area into a grid, and my team took the western edge near the river. We set off at 5:47 a.m., equipped with radios, first aid kits, and maps ready to sweep the area and locate Terry. We moved slowly, calling his name occasionally, but the forest remained silent. The morning passed uneventfully, and by noon there was still no sign of him. Then one of my team members radioed in with the discovery he had found something. I adjusted my course, hiked a half-mile east, and met up with the rest of the team. They were all looking up into the trees, their eyes fixed on something high above a backpack. It was lodged about 30 feet off the ground, in a tree, its straps flapping in the breeze. We immediately recognized it as Terry's. The description his wife gave matched it perfectly. The green Kelty pack with a red patch on the side. One of my team members, Jim, volunteered to climb up and retrieve it. The tree was thin and its branches seemed fragile, not sturdy enough to hold much weight. Yet the backpack was caught there lodged as if it had been thrown with great force. When Jim brought it down, we saw the extent of the damage. The fabric was torn apart with deep gashes, and there was no indication of animal damage. No bites or scratches. It was as though something sharp had shredded it. Inside, we found Terry's water bottle cracked and leaking, and a soggy, half-eaten sandwich crushed into the dirt. There was no blood, at least not yet. At this point, the discovery was strange but not entirely alarming. It was just the first clue in a long search, but the situation started to unravel when we found something else. A couple of hours later, a boot. One of Terry's boots was discovered in a small clearing, sitting upright, as if he had stepped out of it and left it behind. There was no blood or signs of struggle, just the boot perfectly tied and standing alone. We marked the spot thinking we'd find the other boot close by, but the second boot was far away. Around an hour later, another team called in with a chilling report. They had found the other boot, but this time something was horribly wrong. Terry's foot was still inside. The foot was severed just above the ankle, the bone broken, the skin torn. Flies were already circling, and the blood was still fresh, sticky, meaning it hadn't been there long. The discovery sent a wave of tension through the group. This wasn't an accident, nor was it the work of an animal. The severity of the injury was unlike anything we had encountered before. We began to widen our search area, but now we weren't just looking for Terry, we were trying to understand what had happened to him. As we moved deeper into the woods, things started to feel even more unnerving. We began finding more blood. It was splattered in odd places on tree trunks, on rocks, even on branches, high up in the trees. The blood didn't follow a clear pattern. It was scattered in every direction. We started marking it with flags, trying to track its spread. It didn't make sense. No animal attack left blood sprayed across the forest like this. And we weren't finding anything else. No body, no further signs of Terry, just the blood trail. By the time the sun began to set, we had covered half of our grid and found nothing but more blood. The forest grew heavy with an unnatural quiet, and the air started to feel thick, the kind of silence that comes before something bad happens. We set up a base camp near the ridge, knowing we would have to rest and regroup before continuing the search at dawn. But as night fell, the forest didn't feel like the usual wilderness. It felt wrong. There was no wind, no rustling of leaves, no sounds of animals in the night, just stillness. That night I couldn't sleep. Around midnight I heard a loud snap, a branch breaking sharply in the distance. It was a sound I hadn't expected in the silent fog-filled woods. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but I couldn't see anything. I stayed still, waiting, hoping it was just an animal. But the quiet remained oppressive and unsettling. A few hours later, my teammate took over the watch and I finally managed to get some rest. But the strange atmosphere of the night didn't leave me. By morning, we continued the search, following the blood trail further into the woods. It led us up pine trees higher than any of us could climb and down to rocks where the blood was carefully arranged in clusters, like something had intentionally marked the area. We were getting closer to the edge of the search area, but our hope was fading. We called off the search by noon on the third day, officially declaring Terry dead. No one could lose that much blood and still be alive. The report filed by the authorities said it was an animal attack, probably a bear, but I knew that wasn't right. Bears didn't toss backpacks into trees. They didn't paint the forest with blood in deliberate patterns. This wasn't an animal attack. Something else had happened to Terry, something far darker and more sinister. The forest had taken him in a way that didn't fit any explanation we could offer. The team never really talked about the mission again. Some of us stayed in touch, but the experience changed us. I kept a map from the search marked with red X's to show where we had found blood. I didn't look at it often, But when I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there in the forest, something that didn't belong. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything we could explain. It was something darker, and I knew we had encountered it, even if we could never fully understand what it was. Terry had disappeared, but something else had left its mark on the woods that day. Something we would never be able to forget. I had spent much of my life immersed in the wild hiking and surveying forests across North America. But one experience back in the late 1980s changed everything. I was a forestry surveyor in Vunut National Park in Yukon, Canada. This park, stretching over 4,000 square kilometers, is a vast wilderness of dense forests, jagged ridges, and boggy lowlands. A place so remote that it felt as though nature had claimed it long before humans ever stepped foot there. I was used to working alone, enjoying the solitude, and thriving in the peace that only nature can provide. But what I encountered in late August of 1993 shook me to my core and has haunted me ever since. It started as any normal day for me. I woke up early, broke camp, and headed out into the woods ready to survey another section of land. My pack was heavy, filled with the gear I needed for the job: maps, compasses, cameras. I had been surveying this particular section of the forest for hours when I noticed something strange. The trees ahead of me, which should have been standing tall and straight, seemed to be leaning outward. It was subtle, but enough to make me pause. I adjusted my pack and squinted ahead, trying to make sense of it. As I moved closer, I saw a clearing in the trees. The sight that greeted me upon entering that clearing is something I will never forget. The moment I stepped into the clearing, I felt a strange sensation, something I had never experienced before. The entire area was drained of color. The trees stood like white skeletons, their bark peeling away in dry, powdery flakes. The ground was cracked and brittle, crunching underfoot. It wasn't the aftermath of a fire, nor was it frost or some natural phenomenon I had encountered before. It was as if the life had been sucked out of the land. Everything within that circle of trees was a sickly white, as though the very essence of the forest had been erased. I moved further into the clearing, my unease growing with every step. The air was unnaturally still. There was no wind, no sounds of animals or birds. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, and I was the only living thing within it. The ground beneath me felt soft, like I was walking on something far more unnatural than the spongy forest floor I was used to. In the center of the clearing, I saw a small crater about 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It wasn't a hole caused by a meteorite or anything I could immediately recognize. It was just an empty, shallow scoop in the ground, devoid of any debris or rocks. I stood there staring down at the crater, feeling a chill creep up my spine. I couldn't explain what I was seeing, but I knew it was wrong. There was something unsettling about it. It felt as though I had stumbled upon something that should not exist, something that didn't belong in this world. I knew I needed proof of what I had found. My camera sight was in my bag, and I fumbled to pull it out. My hands trembling, I took several wide shots of the bleached trees, capturing the unnatural stillness, and then focused on the crater. The shutter clicked with each photo, but the unease in my chest only deepened. I didn't want to linger in the clearing, but I felt compelled to take more photos. As I captured the images, I grew more and more anxious, my instincts screaming at me to leave. Something about this place wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I packed my camera back into my bag and began to leave, eager to get away from the strange, unnerving sight I had discovered. However, as I walked back, I began to feel increasingly sick. A dull headache had settled behind my eyes and my stomach churned. I paused to take a drink from my canteen, but it didn't help. The discomfort continued to grow, becoming sharper with each step. By the time I reached the last ridge before the ranger station, my head was pounding and I felt like I might pass out. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I leaned against a tree, trying to catch my breath, but the nausea only worsened. Before I knew it, I had vomited an intense, uncontrollable wave that left me gasping for air. I wiped my mouth, realizing that something was terribly wrong. My body was reacting in ways I couldn't explain. Something had happened in that clearing, and it had affected me physically in a way that didn't make sense. I stumbled through the woods, struggling to maintain my balance, my vision blurry, and my head spinning. When I finally made it to the ranger station, I could barely stand. Pete, the ranger on duty, took one look at me and immediately called for medical help. The paramedics arrived quickly, and they rushed me to an ambulance. They asked me where I had been and if I had eaten anything unusual, but my words came out in a jumble. All I could think about was the clearing, the strange trees, and the empty crater. I told them, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. They assumed it was a viral infection or some bug bite that had made me sick. I woke up later in a sterile hospital room, an oxygen mask covering my face. The doctors explained that they believed I had contracted a nasty virus, likely from an insect bite. They administered fluids and antivirals to stabilize me, and after a few days I was well enough to leave. But as I left the hospital, I couldn't shake the memory of the clearing. It felt like I had walked into a place that didn't belong in this world, something unnatural and unsettling. When I returned to my station, I handed my camera over to the technician, eager to have proof of what I had seen. But when the photos were developed, and they were all blurry. Every shot of the clearing, the trees, and the crater came out as nothing but a fuzzy mess. It wasn't overexposure or underexposure. The images were just blank. I couldn't believe it. It was as though the camera itself had refused to capture what I had seen. The technician and my boss shrugged it off, assuming I had been delirious. They didn't accuse me of lying, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They told me to let it go, and I tried to move on, but I couldn't. Every time I went back into the woods, I found myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that ashen clearing again. I never did, but the memory of that place stayed with me. It still haunts me, and I don't know if I'll ever truly be able to shake the feeling that something unnatural was hiding in the forest that day. Years have passed since that encounter, and I've tried to bury it. But there are times when I can't help but wonder if whatever I found that day is still out there waiting to be discovered again. The clearing, the trees, the strange hole in the ground, it was like something from another world, and I'll never forget it. I'll never forget how it made me feel so small and helpless, and how I knew deep in my gut that it wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was something else, something that doesn't belong. And I have a feeling it's still out there. A few years ago, I went on a solo hike that turned out to be one of the strangest and most unsettling experiences of my life. I wasn't an experienced hiker, but I'd always enjoyed the quiet peace of the woods. I was feeling cooped up and needed a break from the daily grind. So I decided to explore a trail that I had heard about. It was an hour away from my home, a place tucked deep into the woods, a path that wasn't well known and wasn't overrun with tourists. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to get away and enjoy some solitude. The drive to the trailhead was peaceful, with just the hum of the engine and the trees blurring past my window. I parked my car in a small gravel lot, locked it, and began my hike. The trail started off normal enough, quiet with the crunch of leaves underfoot and the scent of fresh pine in the air. But there was something about this forest that felt different. The usual comfort that nature provided felt a little distant, replaced by an odd sense of unease that I couldn't quite explain. Still, I pushed it aside and continued walking, hoping the feeling would pass, but then something happened that I couldn't ignore. As I was walking through the woods, I suddenly felt the temperature drop. It wasn't gradual like the natural coolness of a shaded area, but a sudden and sharp shift in the air. It felt like the sun had disappeared entirely, even though the sky was still bright and clear. I looked up expecting to see a cloud blocking the sun, but there was nothing. Just an eerie shadow that seemed to sweep over the entire clearing I was in. It was big enough to cover the whole area, and it passed so quickly that I didn't even have time to figure out what it was. My heart started to race and I froze mid-step, water still dripping from my bottle as I looked up at the sky. There were no planes, no birds, no clouds, just that massive shadow. And then as quickly as it had come, the sunlight returned, leaving me standing there shaken. I wasn't the only one who had noticed it. Andre, my hiking companion for the day, had been with me. He stopped talking and looked up too, his face pale with disbelief. I could tell that he had felt the same strange shift in the atmosphere. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice sounding unnerved. I couldn't answer. There were no words for it. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I glanced around nervously, trying to make sense of the strange shadow. But there was nothing to explain it. No obvious source, no explanation that made sense. The woods had gone silent. Even the wind seemed to stop, and everything was still. There were no birds singing, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, just a thick, unnatural quiet that seemed to hang in the air. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Andre was starting to look worried, and so was I. We stood there for a minute or two, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement. It was almost like everything in the woods had frozen in place. I kept expecting something to break through the trees or descend from the sky, but nothing ever came. After a few moments of tense silence, I finally spoke. "We should go," I said, not really knowing why, but feeling a growing sense of urgency to leave, Andre. Didn't argue. He grabbed the map out of his pack and stuffed it in, and we began heading back. We didn't stick to the trail. We just wanted to get out of that strange, silent place as fast as possible. Every step we took felt like we were being watched, and every rustle in the trees made my heart jump. We didn't speak much as we walked, both of us acutely aware of the unease in the air. There was an underlying tension that neither of us could shake. It was like the woods were closing in around us, and we were being driven out. As we hurried back, I kept glancing up, half expecting to see the shadow again, but it never returned. Still, the strange feeling lingered, and by the time we reached the trailhead and saw Andre's truck parked in the lot, I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I threw my pack in the back and climbed in, eager to leave the woods behind. We sat in silence for a few moments, both of us catching our breath. After a long while, Andre finally broke the silence, trying to rationalize what had happened. It was probably just a bird, like a big hawk or something. You know, when they fly low, their shadow can look bigger than it really is, he said, his voice uncertain. I wanted to agree with him, to tell myself that it was nothing more than a natural occurrence, but deep down I knew that wasn't what had happened. The shadow had been too big, too solid. It wasn't just a bird passing overhead, and the way it had moved so fast without any sound or warning, it didn't fit any natural explanation. I nodded in agreement, but I didn't believe it. The wind had felt wrong too, like it had been chasing something, as if the wind itself had been connected to the shadow. The whole experience felt off, something that couldn't be explained away with the rational explanations we were trying to give ourselves. We drove back to town mostly in silence, the radio filling the space between us. Every now and then I would glance at Andre and I could tell he was still rattled, just like I was. When we got to my place, Andre didn't stick around like he usually did. There were no beers to crack open or stories to rehash. He simply said goodbye and drove off, eager to put some distance between himself and the strange experience we had just gone through. I didn't sleep much that night either. My mind kept racing, going over every moment of what happened, trying to make sense of it, but there was no explanation that fit. Over the next few days, I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just a fluke, a random event that had no real meaning. But deep down, I knew that whatever we saw that day wasn't just some coincidence. It wasn't a bird or a strange weather phenomenon. It was something else, something that didn't belong in the woods. That shadow had been too real, too solid, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I tried to move on, and I went hiking again, but not on that trail. I couldn't bring myself to go back there, not after what happened. Every time I went outside, especially on clear days, I found myself looking up, half expecting to see that shadow again. And sometimes I could almost feel it lingering at the back of my mind, waiting to return. I don't know what it was, and I don't think I ever will. But I know that it wasn't just a trick of the light. That shadow was something real, and it was something that still haunts me to this day. In the summer of 1983, I was a part of a search and rescue operation in Olympic National Forest. The call came late on a Tuesday night, reporting a missing hiker named Terry Fishgold. He had been an experienced solo hiker, familiar with the trails in the forest, and his wife hadn't been concerned at first. But when Terry didn't return by Monday evening, she began to worry and contacted the authorities on Tuesday. His last known location was a trailhead near the Kino River, and he was headed toward a ridge around 8 miles north. Given his experience, I expected it to be a straightforward search, one that would end with us finding him by sundown. But as the days passed, I realized this search would be far from routine. We gathered at the trailhead the next morning, around 30 to 40 volunteers, law enforcement, and search and rescue personnel. We split the forest into grids and set off at first light, with my team taking the western edge near the river. The goal was to find Terry and bring him back by nightfall, but by noon we hadn't found anything. There was still no sign of him. Then one of my team members radioed in. He had found something. I hiked a half mile to join them, and when I arrived, the first sign of Terry we found was his backpack lodged 30 feet high in a tree. The backpack, green with a red patch, just as Terry's wife had described, was caught in the branches of a thin tree. It seemed to have been thrown with considerable force. Jim, one of my teammates, volunteered to climb up and retrieve it. The tree was too fragile to support much weight, but Jim managed to bring it down. The damage to the pack was severe, with long gashes running through the fabric. Inside, there was a cracked water bottle and a soggy, half-eaten sandwich. There was no blood, but it wasn't long before we found more troubling signs. A couple of hours later, another teammate found Terry's boot in a clearing. It was sitting upright as though Terry had simply stepped out of it. There was no sign of struggle, no blood. We assumed the other boot would be nearby, but it wasn't. A while later, we received a report from another team. They had found the second boot, but it wasn't empty. Terry's foot was still inside, severed just above the ankle. The break wasn't clean, and there were flies circling the wound. The blood was still fresh, meaning Terry's foot had been severed recently. That discovery was a turning point for the mission. Something didn't add up, and the situation began to feel increasingly abnormal. We widened our search, but instead of finding more of Terry, we found something even stranger: blood. The blood was scattered across the forest in an unusual pattern. It was smeared on tree trunks, flicked on branches, and even marked on rocks. It didn't make sense. It didn't follow any logical pattern of an animal attack. It was as if someone had been walking through the forest deliberately marking their path with blood. By the end of the day, we had found no more clues about Terry's whereabouts, just more blood. By the time night fell, the atmosphere in the forest had grown heavy. The usual sounds of the woods whine in the trees, animals stirring, were eerily absent. It was as if the forest had become unnaturally quiet, and that silence only added to the growing unease. We set up camp for the night, but sleep was impossible. There was no peace in the air. We continued our search the following day, but we found no sign of Terry. Only more blood marks higher up on trees in spots that no bear could reach. We were no closer to understanding what had happened. As the search dragged on, the clues became stranger, the silence in the woods more oppressive, and the feeling that something was wrong grew stronger. We called off the search on the third day. Officially, the authorities concluded that Terry had likely died from an animal attack, but I knew something didn't fit. No bear could toss a pack 30 feet into a tree or spread blood so methodically through the woods. That mission remained with me. The strange bloodstains, the missing person who we never found, and the eerie silence of the forest, these things haunted me. As years passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been out there in the forest with us. Something that didn't belong. Something had taken Terry, but it wasn't an animal. We may never know what truly happened to him, but one thing was clear: it wasn't a natural death, and the forest held secrets that we may never fully understand.